In every age, the human soul wrestles with its reflection. Some refuse to look. They build golden masks, radiant with charm, confidence, and self-assurance, crafted so meticulously that even they forget it. It is only a mask. The narcissist does not simply love themselves. They worship a false image, a god they made in their own likeness. But no mask can outshine the light of truth forever. There comes a time when the divine psyche, through subtle and often brutal means, disables the illusion, not with thunder or wrath, but with the quiet, unrelenting pressure of truth. First, the very shadow they tried to exile returns. The parts of themselves they buried, shame, fear, envy, gather in the dark, not to destroy but to demand an acknowledgement. This shadow does not strike from without, but erodes from within. Their perfection begins to rot at the edges. The smile stiffens. The lies require more effort. The self they created to dominate others becomes a prison, and the soul starts to rot in its isolation. Then the admirers drift away, one by one, not by sudden betrayal, but by the slow wearing down of illusion. God does not tear away the crowd. He simply allows the truth to weigh more than the performance. People stop laughing at jokes that were never funny. They stop nodding at words that were always empty. Silence grows louder. The narcissist finds themselves in a hall of mirrors, and none reflect back what they need. The magic of projection fails. Once, their words could bind others, like spells. Now, those words fall flat. They project confidence, but are met with suspicion. They invoke pity and receive indifference. The world stops cooperating with their illusions, as if heaven itself has refused to play along. They lash out, confused. But the mirror no longer responds. Somewhere deep inside, the soul rebels. The inner feminine or masculine, whichever part they buried to maintain the persona, breaks through. It may emerge as rage, addiction, obsession, or despair. They cannot maintain order because something wilder, something sacred, insists on being heard. The carefully built ego starts to fracture, and the truth seeps in like water through old stone. The role they played, hero, genius, saint, no longer fits. The archetypal power that once surged through them fades. Not because God is cruel, but because the role was never theirs to own. It was borrowed, misused. What was once a source of admiration now feels like parody. They stand center stage, but the audience is gone and the spotlight burns cold. At last, the soul brings them face to face with themselves. Not the grandiose self, but the wounded child beneath, the one they tried so hard to forget. This is the divine mercy. To disable the narcissist is not to destroy them, but to offer them a chance to become real. Stripped of masks, abandoned by illusions, they are finally free to begin again, not as gods, but as humans. And perhaps, if they dare to endure it, as something even greater. The narcissist lives within a fortress of mirrors, each one carefully angled to reflect a perfect image back at them. They do not see themselves. They see only what they want to believe they are. Every glance, every word, every action becomes part of a script, written not by the soul, but by a fear of inadequacy, too deep to face. To the narcissist, this false self is everything. It is strength, value, purpose, and identity. But beneath the gleaming surface lies a shadow they refuse to acknowledge. That shadow is not an enemy. It is the lost half of the self, the truth buried beneath years of denial and delusion. And it is there that the disabling begins, not from outside forces, but from the forgotten within. God, in divine wisdom, does not need to strike a narcissist down with fire or ruin. Instead, he allows the soul's own shadow to do the work. The shadow is composed of all the truths the narcissist could not bear to include in their image: vulnerability, fear, envy, guilt. These elements are not sins in themselves. They are parts of being human. But the narcissist cannot be human. They must be exceptional, untouchable, superior. And so, these parts are cast out, driven deep into the unconscious. There, they fester. But the psyche cannot bear division forever. The human soul, at its root, seeks wholeness. What has been repressed must return. And so, the shadow begins to stir. It speaks through moments of irrational anger, sudden depression, or a haunting sense of emptiness. It breaks through in dreams, in failed relationships, in the gnawing suspicion that something vital is missing. The narcissist may fight these signs. They may double down on their persona, work harder to control others, seek louder praise, bigger victories. But it only hastens the unraveling. The disabling is not sudden. It is slow, methodical, and deeply psychological. The narcissist, who once seemed unshakable, begins to falter. Their mask no longer fits. It slips at odd moments, in public failure, in private despair. They grow more reactive, more desperate to be seen. But the more they demand attention, the more they repel it. People begin to see through them. But more importantly, they begin to see through themselves. Not all at once, but in glimpses they cannot unsee. This is the sacred undoing. God disables them by allowing their own shadow to rise. Not as punishment, but as invitation. It is a call to integration, to stop clinging to the hollow image and turn toward what is real. But for the narcissist, this is a kind of death. The false self must be relinquished, and that feels like annihilation. They may resist with all their might. They may blame others, lash out, retreat into isolation. But the deeper truth continues to press forward. At some point, the narcissist may feel they are falling apart. In truth, they are being dismantled, not by an outside force, but by the soul's insistence on becoming whole. The person they pretended to be begins to dissolve, and what is left is raw, vulnerable, and terrifying. This is where many break. But it is also where healing can begin, if they have the courage to endure the exposure. God, through the mechanism of the shadow, allows the narcissist to be disabled from within. The illusion collapses, and with it, the lie that they are above the human condition. They are brought down, not in wrath, but in truth. And it is only in that truth, painful, humbling, and deeply sacred, that the possibility of redemption appears. The disabling, then, is not cruelty. It is the beginning of a return to the self, not the self as spectacle, but the self as soul. There is a silence that heals and a silence that haunts. For the narcissist, silence is often unbearable, not because they are simply extroverted or enjoy attention, but because the absence of admiration is the absence of self. Their identity has been constructed from the outside in. They become who others say they are, living through reflection rather than substance. This makes isolation not just uncomfortable, but existentially threatening. And yet it is precisely through isolation that the divine begins to work. God disables the narcissist, not with thunderous rejection, but with space, vast, echoing space, in which no applause can be heard, and no mirrors remain to reflect their chosen image. It is in this isolation that the soul is forced to confront its reality, not a punishment, but a profound act of spiritual surgery. The narcissist often gathers people around them, not for connection, but for validation. Relationships are tools. Interactions are performances. Praise is fuel. But when God begins the quiet process of disarming their illusions, these sources of validation begin to dry up. Friends grow distant, followers disengage. Even the most loyal admirers begin to see inconsistencies, to sense manipulation, to feel the weight of the one-sided bond. Slowly, people stop responding, not out of malice, but from fatigue. The narcissist, without an audience, starts to falter, not publicly at first, but internally. The silence grows heavier, more personal, and in that silence, a question begins to form. Who am I without them? This question is terrifying for someone who has never developed a stable inner world. The narcissist has curated themselves for so long, always optimizing, always adjusting for admiration, that the true self has been neglected, atrophied, even forgotten. So, when they are finally alone, stripped of external affirmation, they experience not solitude, but abandonment. They interpret the silence as rejection, not invitation. The divine, however, does not abandon them. It simply removes the noise long enough for them to hear what has always been present, their own soul whispering beneath the performance. Isolation becomes a mirror, but not one they can control. It does not reflect the grandiose self, it reveals the hidden wounds, the unmet needs, the fragile ego desperately trying to survive behind a mask of superiority. This mirror cannot be smashed. It shows them the child they were, the one who first learned that love must be earned, that value comes from applause, that vulnerability is dangerous. These lessons, once survival strategies, have become chains. Isolation reveals those chains and begins the process of breaking them. During this time, the narcissist may spiral. The absence of affirmation feels like suffocation. They may attempt to re-engage old patterns, revive relationships, stir up drama, anything to avoid the stillness. But the divine silence is persistent. The usual tactics no longer yield the same results. The attention they crave becomes elusive. And in this desert of recognition, they begin to thirst, not for attention, but for meaning. This is where the transformation begins. God disables them not by denying love, but by removing false substitutes. Isolation clears the stage, dismantles the set, and leaves only the soul and the truth it has long denied. For those willing to stay in the silence, something profound can happen. They begin to sense a presence, not the crowd, not the admirer, but something deeper and more eternal. The stillness reveals the voice of the divine, speaking not to the persona, but to the soul. This voice does not flatter, it does not entertain, it invites. It calls the narcissist to look within, to begin the long and painful journey of discovering who they are when no one is watching. It is through this divine isolation that healing becomes possible. Not immediate, not easy, but real. The narcissist, once surrounded by admirers, finds themselves alone, but it is here that they begin to encounter God, not as a distant judge, but as an inner guide. The silence, once feared, becomes sacred, and in that sacred silence, the false self begins to die, not as a loss, but as a liberation. What emerges is not a perfected image, but a real person, flawed, vulnerable, and finally whole. There is a certain magic the narcissist wields, often unnoticed by those around them. It is the ability to cast projections into the world, images, roles, impressions that bend reality around their will. This projection is not conscious in the ordinary sense. It is instinctual, a defense mechanism refined over years of avoiding the pain of inadequacy. The narcissist believes the image they've created is real, and they expect the world to reflect that image back to them. When it does, they feel powerful, affirmed, almost invincible. But the world is not a mirror designed for any one person's illusions, and God in divine mercy slowly begins to dissolve the power of these projections. What once worked so effortlessly, charm, persuasion, intimidation, charisma, begins to fail. Reality stops cooperating. The narcissist's false image no longer holds sway over others. This collapse is not punishment, it is the undoing of illusion, the disarming of a lie that has kept the soul bound in fear. In the early stages, The narcissist can sense something has changed. Though they cannot name it, they speak the same way they always have, but the reactions they're used to, admiration, agreement, deference, begin to falter. Their confidence seems less convincing to others. Their carefully calculated expressions of superiority or martyrdom fall flat. People don't respond as expected, some even push back. Confusion sets in. The narcissist, so accustomed to managing others' perceptions, begins to lose control. They redouble their efforts, exaggerating their charm, amplifying their suffering, or intensifying their criticism of others. But the projection no longer sticks. What once manipulated now exposes. What once seduced now repels. This failure is not external misfortune. It is an interior unraveling, a divine correction. The projections the narcissist depends on are like masks fitted to an audience. When the audience sees through the act, the mask no longer serves its purpose. And without a mask, the narcissist is left exposed, not just to others, but to themselves. This is the beginning of insight. Naive though it is, they must face the reality that their sense of self was never truly seen, only performed. The loss of control over perception feels like death, because for the narcissist, perception was identity. God allows this collapse to protect the soul from deeper harm. The continued success of projection would only lead them further from the truth, from authentic connection, from the possibility of transformation. By allowing projection to fail, God interrupts the cycle of self-deception. This interruption often feels cruel. The narcissist may feel betrayed by the very people who once adored them. They may accuse others of being blind, disloyal, or envious. But the betrayal is not in others. It is in the fragility of the image they created. They begin to understand, perhaps only dimly at first, that admiration based on illusion is not love, and power based on projection is hollow. In this vulnerable state, some narcissists begin to turn inward. Stripped of the ability to control how others see them, they are confronted with the question, who am I? Without the story I've told, without admiration, without superiority, without the constant effort to be more than I am. This is where true humility begins, not as self-hatred, but as the first honest look at the self beyond projection. God disables them, not to destroy, but to reorient. The soul was never meant to live through masks. It was meant to live in truth, even if that truth is raw and unpolished. As the power of projection dies, something more real begins to stir beneath it. Not the inflated self, but the actual person, wounded, uncertain, yet still worthy of grace. Relationships, once based on performance, begin to fall away. But this clears space for relationships rooted in authenticity to grow. The narcissist may resist this at first. They may mourn the loss of their influence. But if they stay with the discomfort, if they allow the projections to fall away completely, they may begin to experience a new kind of strength, one not dependent on illusion, but grounded in reality. This is divine mercy in its most disruptive form. God allows the projections to fail so that the person may be found. The image collapses, but the soul begins to rise, not in grandeur, but in truth. And in that truth, they may finally become someone real enough to be loved, not for who they pretended to be, but for who they actually are. There is a hidden tension within every human soul, a delicate balance between the masculine and the feminine, the assertive and the receptive, the logical and the intuitive. For the narcissist, this balance is often shattered early in life. One side of their inner world is exalted and overdeveloped, while the other is repressed, denied, or even despised. In their pursuit of a perfected image, they disown the aspects of themselves that do not fit the persona they believe will grant them power, admiration, or invulnerability. The repressed inner opposite, The anima in men, the animus in women, does not disappear. It waits. And when God begins the work of dismantling the narcissistic illusion, this denied aspect starts to surface. Not as a gentle whisper, but as a storm. It breaks through the cracks in the false self, disrupting order, unsettling identity, and demanding to be heard. This rebellion from within is not madness. It is divine interference, pulling the soul back toward wholeness. For the narcissist, the disowned inner opposite is dangerous precisely because it is uncontrollable. A man who worships power and rationality will fear the parts of himself that feel deeply, need others, or long for beauty and vulnerability. A woman who constructs her worth around independence, competence, and control may suppress her longing for intimacy, her intuition, or her capacity to be tender. In both cases, the rejected side is not evil. It is simply not permitted. But the soul cannot live divided forever. The repressed energy builds in the unconscious, and eventually it bursts through, often in ways the narcissist cannot anticipate or explain. This is when chaos begins to unfold. The narcissist may start to behave in ways that feel foreign to their carefully managed identity. Emotional outbursts, irrational decisions, impulsive behaviors, deep mood swings, obsessions, or unexplained fear may take over. They may fall into relationships they cannot control, become consumed with jealousy or dependency, or experience emotional hunger they find humiliating. The more they try to suppress or ignore it, the more it intensifies. They are no longer in charge of their own narrative. The very traits they once saw as signs of weakness begin to dominate their inner life. This is not punishment. It is the sacred uprising of the repressed soul. God allows this eruption, not to torment them, but to break the illusion that they are whole without their other half. The divine does not force wholeness from above. It summons it from within. By allowing the repressed anima or animus to rise uncontrollably, God exposes the lie of the narcissist's constructed self. The narcissist, who once seemed so composed, begins to unravel in front of themselves. This unraveling is the doorway to transformation, but it feels like madness. It is, in truth, a confrontation with everything they have denied. They may resist this inner rebellion with every ounce of their will. They may seek to silence it through distraction, addiction, domination, or further performance. But the divine presence is relentless. The anima, or animus, does not relent because it speaks for the part of the soul that still longs to be whole. Until this inner opposite is acknowledged and integrated, the narcissist cannot become fully human. They are trapped in a persona, a half-self, a mask. The rebellion within is the soul's protest against that imprisonment. If the narcissist chooses to surrender to this inner revolution, not in defeat, but in humility, they may begin to see the parts of themselves they were taught to reject as sacred. The vulnerability they feared is a gateway to compassion. The intuition they ignored becomes a source of wisdom. The emotional depth they denied allows them to love with authenticity. As this once repressed aspect becomes integrated, the narcissist begins to soften, not in weakness, but in truth. This process is not instant. It is painful, slow, and filled with inner conflict. But it is necessary. God disables the narcissist, not by taking away power, but by restoring the parts of the soul they abandoned. The rebellion of the inner opposite is the soul demanding its full expression, and only when the narcissist listens to that voice, embraces what they once rejected, and allows themselves to be both strong and soft, both commanding and receptive, both clear and mysterious, can they begin the journey toward real healing. What was once divided becomes whole, and in that wholeness, there is finally peace. There comes a moment when even the most intricately constructed identity begins to fracture under its own weight. For the narcissist, identity is not something discovered, but something built, layer by layer, gesture by gesture, a structure of impressions, carefully shaped to embody a role they believe will bring them value. This role might be that of the savior, the genius, the martyr, the hero, or the visionary. Whatever it is, it serves as armor against the fear that beneath the performance, they are nothing special at all. But the psyche, shaped by deeper forces, fierce and ego, can command, eventually begins to reject what is false. The archetypal role the narcissist has assumed, borrowed from cultural stories, childhood fantasies, and inner wounds, begins to lose its power. It stops feeding them. It starts to betray them. The script fails. The audience turns cold, and they are left standing in a costume that no longer fits. This is not just the loss of identity, it is the crumbling of a personal mythology. The roles the narcissist assumes are often larger than life, because they are not grounded in reality, but in the hunger to escape shame or mediocrity. To feel worthy, they must be extraordinary. Every word they speak, every story they tell, every success they showcase is carefully aligned with that role. But when the divine begins to intervene, it does not strike the narcissist down. It simply reveals the cracks in the narrative. Life circumstances arise that make the role unsustainable. A failure they cannot spin, a critique they cannot silence, a public moment where the mask slips. These moments act as mirrors that reflect back, not the heroic figure they imagined, but a fragile, uncertain person who no longer believes in the performance themselves. The pain of this realization is acute, because it isn't just embarrassment or disappointment, it's the sense that the very self is dissolving. The narcissist is not just losing a public image, they are losing what they believed made them exist. Without the role, they feel invisible, even meaningless. And yet, this very collapse is grace. God allows the false role to deteriorate so that the narcissist might stop identifying with the surface of their being and begin seeking the depth they have long ignored. In the midst of this collapse, the narcissist often experiences a profound sense of disorientation. They may swing between identities, trying on new masks, hoping one will restore the lost feeling of control or importance. But each new role feels thinner than the last. None bring the same admiration or internal thrill. The emptiness begins to speak louder than the applause. What once felt like purpose now feels like performance. They are being stripped, layer by layer, of the illusions that held their inner world together. This stripping is sacred. The divine is not interested in humiliating them. It is interested in liberating them. The role must fall apart because the person underneath has never truly lived. The narcissist has been playing a god, a savior, a star, but the soul does not need to be worshipped. It needs to be known. When the archetype fails, the human can finally emerge, and that emergence is the beginning of truth. The narcissist may mourn the role as if it were a death. In some ways, it is. But in that mourning, they begin to feel again. They touch sorrow, regret, even humility, feelings they had buried long ago. These feelings are not signs of failure. They are the foundation of authenticity. With each passing day, the need to impress diminishes, and the desire to connect, really connect, begins to stir. This is how God disables them, with quiet precision, not through thunderous defeat, but through the gentle dismantling of the lie. The persona disintegrates, and in its place, something truer begins to rise. It is not grand, it is not spectacular, but it is real, and in that realness, the narcissist may find, for the first time, a self not built for others to admire, but simply built to be. Not a role, not a performance, but a soul, returned to its origin, quietly beginning again. There is no deception more persistent than the one we weave around our own wounds. The narcissist, though outwardly confident and even dominant, is often governed by an unconscious wound so deep it has become the center of their identity. They do not remember the precise moment it formed. Perhaps a parent's neglect, a moment of humiliation, a slow erosion of being unseen or unvalued. But instead of acknowledging the pain, they built around it a fortress of superiority. It was a survival instinct, not a malicious choice. They learned to inflate where they felt smallest, to dominate where they once felt powerless, to demand attention where it was once withheld. And over time, they forgot the wound existed at all. They became the mask. But God does not forget what the soul needs, and in a mysterious, often agonizing way, God allows life to peel back the defenses until that original wound is exposed, not to shame them, but to heal them at last. This exposure rarely happens in moments of triumph. It happens in collapse, a failed marriage, a public fall from grace, a betrayal that cuts deep enough to bypass the ego entirely. These moments are not punishments, they are awakenings. The divine reaches into the narcissist's life through events they cannot control, feelings they cannot repress, and mirrors they cannot shatter. These moments bring the wound back into view. Suddenly, the pain they worked so hard to bury is alive again, raw, irrational, unbearable. But it is only through this rawness that real transformation begins. The narcissist, for perhaps the first time, begins to feel vulnerable, not as a performance, but as a reality. They may cry alone, not for pity, but because there is no other option. They may rage, not to manipulate, but because the pain has finally broken through. And in these moments of honest suffering, they meet themselves not as the person they hope to be, but as the person they have always been, wounded, afraid, and desperate for love. This is where grace meets them, not in their strength, but in their undoing. The wound, once buried in shadow, becomes the very place where light enters. It is a difficult process. The narcissist often resists it with everything they have. They will try to numb the pain again, return to the mask, reclaim the role. But those old tactics no longer work. The wound is too close to the surface now. The pain, too honest, and slowly they begin to sit with it. They stop running. They stop performing. They just feel. And that feeling, unbearable as it seems, begins to soften them. The heart that had been hardened by years of defense begins to beat again, not with pride, but with humility. This is where true empathy is born, not from an intellectual understanding of others' pain, but from finally encountering their own. The narcissist, who once saw others as instruments for validation, begins to see them as mirrors of shared suffering. They begin to realize that their cruelty, their manipulation, their grandiosity, it all came from a place of desperate self-protection. And if their pain was that deep, perhaps others are hurting too. This awareness is not philosophical. It is lived, felt, earned in the crucible of their own collapse. And it is here, in the midst of brokenness, that God begins to rebuild them, not as a superior being, but as a human one. The wound remains a scar, but it is no longer infected. It becomes a place of tenderness, not shame, a source of wisdom, not denial. The narcissist may never be the same, and that is the point. The false self is gone. What remains is fragile, uncertain, but real, and real is enough. This is the final disabling, the moment when the narcissist realizes that their deepest pain was not their enemy, but their teacher, that their suffering was not meaningless, but sacred, and that the wound they spent their whole life hiding is the very place where God chose to enter, not to destroy them, but to save them, quietly, completely, forever.